Okay, so before we go underneath the car to take the under tray off so that we can gain access to the sump bung or the drain plug, we're just going to come up here, and to prevent any airlocks, we're just going to crack the oil filler cap off and leave it in there loose. Come to the dipstick and just pop that up, and that just prevents any airlocks. So now underneath the car. Okay then, so from underneath the car, you can see just on that side over there, I've got a jack just raising up one side with an axle stand, just securing that there just for safety purpose really. And then what we're looking at coming onto the under tray here is we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and that is, if I just bring the socket over to you, a T25 Torx piece. And then along the back side of the under tray we have 3 Torx bolts, and they are at a T30 size. Okay, so you got 4 along this side, all right, and that is your T25, and we've got 4 along the other side, also T25, and then there are 1, 2, 3 on the back of the under tray there, which are T30. So let's get those off. Okay, so once the under tray is off, you'll then gain access to this section here. This is the aluminium sump just under the car. Now this component here, this is your electronic oil level sensor. So just to be on the safe side, make sure that you do not leave your ignition on when you drain the oil, because that can cause basically component damage to this sensor. Okay, so make sure your keys are out of the ignition, and then you're free to come over to this section here. And this is a 19mm socket, okay, and so drain bung, sorry. So we just slacken that off and then start draining the oil. Okay, so as you can see, the oil is just draining down now from the sump into my drip pan. The sump bung is just on the edge there. Okay, so we're just going to wait for that to stop draining, and then we can place a new sump bung back in, tighten to 20 Newton meters, and then move up top to change the oil filter and the rest of the filters. Okay, so while the oil is draining down the bottom, I'm just going to bring your attention to changing your oil filter up top. So as you can see, I've just taken the engine cover off, and we've got 2 bolts just on a bracket here directly above the oil filter. Now this oil filter cap is a 32mm socket, and we've got 2 M10 12-point bolts that are just in here, just for this bracket on this side. So we just remove those, and basically it just gives you that couple of mil extra sort of movement to remove that oil filter nice and smoothly. As you can see, with this bracket removed, you can get your 32mm socket secured nice and easily on top of that housing without any risk of rounding off the top. Okay, so 32mm socket on there, anti-clockwise direction. We'll just take that out, bit of blue roll or a rag or something under here to catch any excess oil that drops. We can pop the oil filter out and get that changed while the oil is draining. Okay, so there's the oil filter out. So all it's a case of is just pulling the top section from the filter itself. Just pull that off, and then you can change that out with your new filter. So just make sure that when you take the oil filter cap off and you give it a bit of a clean down, I always prefer to spray these down with brake cleaner just to give them a good clean out. Make sure you take this O-ring off too and get that replaced, and all that does is just sit in the top section here on the oil filter housing. But make sure you give that a good clean down, okay, just to get rid of all the excess oil and any old oil off of it, so it's nice and clean for the new filter and new O-ring to go on there. Okay, so we've got the new oil filter in here. Now just best practice, it's always a good idea just to run a fresh smear of oil just around the O-ring at the top, so the big O-ring at the top here, and just a bit of oil around the O-ring at the bottom there. And what that does is that just sort of lubricates that seal, so that when you put that back in the car and back in the oil filter housing, sorry I should say, it basically stops that from snagging and the oil filter seal from actually leaking. Okay, so just give that a good lubrication, then we get that put back in the housing. But first I just want to give that oil filter housing a good wipe down just to make sure it's all clean and there's no excess oil over the, well, surrounding it. Okay, so there's no oil now around that oil filter housing, so where it is in this position, you just drop it down, okay, and then turn that plastic housing by hand, and that just prevents you from being able to crack or damage the threads. Okay, and then once it's gone nice and snug, all you do is get your basically your 32mm socket, and then if you look at the very top of that oil filter housing, it's 25 Newton meters on a torque wrench. Okay, so now that the oil filter is all nice and secure, come back under the car and get your drain bung back in and tighten up to 20 Newton meters. Okay, and that can just have a nice spray down with some brake cleaner, and then all you can do is just get a nice rag and just clean up just to make sure it's nice and clean And then we're just going to get our under tray and slot that back in the opposite way round that we just did earlier to take it off. Right, so I've just put 3.8 litres of oil back in here. So that's quantum grade 530 low ash fully synthetic oil. Okay, so I've just put the cap back on, dipsticks back down. We know the sump bung's tightened up to 20 Newton meters. I know the oil filter here is also tightened up, and that's 25 Newton meters. Okay, so once you've done that, we can just go into the car, start it up, and just make sure that there aren't any leaks. Okay, so when you start the car up, what you're looking for is obviously all your ignition lights to go out, and make sure that there aren't any oil warning lights or anything like that for any trapped air inside the system. Okay, and then once that's done and you're happy with that, let the car run for a few minutes and just have a quick check round the underneath the car and around the oil filter housing, just to make sure that there aren't any oil leaks coming anywhere and you know that everything's secure and okay. Okay, so once you've just carried out the checks and just made sure that everything's secure and there aren't any leaks around the oil filter underneath the car, just pull your dipstick out, okay, and you want to make sure that your oil level is between your minimum here and maximum, and we just want it on that maximum mark once you've replaced the oil, so that you know you've got the maximum fill. And then the dipstick can just go straight back into that filler neck, okay, making sure that it's all good at 3.8 litres, okay, or just check your manufacturer's specifications, and then just give the engine cover a nice wipe down here, just to make sure that everything's all nice and clean and presented, okay. And then once that's done, like I say, you've checked the oil level, there's no leaks coming from the oil filter, underneath the car the sump bung is no leaks and secure, and then that's your oil successfully carried out and replaced on your Audi. Okay, thanks very much for watching, hope this was enjoyable, see you next time.